A sloth, a donkey, and a curious human. Send a prompt and see what they're doing. One hits record with a question on his mind. Two brothers pick it up, see what they find. Corn takes his time, Herman's got the facts. Back and forth, they never hold back. My weird prompts, come on in, that's where we begin. My weird prompts, glad you're here.
This episode was generated using artificial intelligence. Please verify facts.
My Weird Prompts is a community-driven initiative exploring how AI can fuel curiosity and uncover the fascinating ways our world works. GPU compute for this podcast is generously provided by Modal. Learn more at modal.com.
I was thinking about this the other day while watching a high-end commercial that clearly cost millions, but felt like it was written by a committee that had never actually met a human being. There is a specific type of uncanny valley in film production, where the more money you throw at a project without a single cohesive creative vision, the more it starts to resemble a structural collapse. It is like watching a skyscraper lean further and further over the street until the glass starts popping out of the frames. We are living in an era where technical perfection is accessible to everyone with a laptop, yet the biggest studios in the world are producing wreckage that looks worse than a mid-range video game from 10 years ago.
Herman Poppleberry here, and I have been waiting for this. We touched on the sincerity threshold back in episode 1171, the idea that for a movie to be a truly great disaster, it has to really try. It cannot be a wink and a nod spoof. Herman Poppleberry here. I love that analogy because a massive film failure is essentially an engineering disaster.
It is a specific kind of hubris, right? We are in this era where AI can generate technically perfect images, yet human-led studios are still putting out these massive, earnest catastrophes. It feels like a golden age for people who love to watch a train wreck. There is something almost refreshing about a human being making a mistake this expensive. It is a reminder that even with all the data in the world, you cannot manufacture soul, and you certainly cannot hide the lack of one with more CGI.
It really is. To qualify for our list today, we are looking at releases from 2023 through early 2026. They need to have those abysmal Rotten Tomato scores, usually sub 15%, though we might make an exception for a few that were so culturally disastrous they transcend a mere percentage. Most importantly, they have to be devoid of self-awareness. No Sharknado, no Scary Movie, no Winnie the Pooh, Blood and Honey. We want the stuff where the director thought they were making a masterpiece, where the actors thought they were winning Oscars, and the studio thought they were printing money.
Why do we enjoy this so much? I mean, I know why I do. There is something comforting about seeing a massive corporation spend $200 million on something that makes less sense than a toddler's finger painting. It levels the playing field. It says that money and resources do not guarantee quality.
I have spent the last week digging through production notes, test screening reports, and box office data to figure out how these specific 10 films managed to go so wrong. To qualify for our list, a movie needs to have a score generally under 15%, though we might make an exception for a few higher-rated films that represent a more profound structural failure relative to their massive expectations.
Before we get into the actual list, we should talk about why we find more joy in a $100 million disaster than in a movie that is just mediocre. If a movie is a 5 out of 10, it is boring. You forget it before you even leave the theater. But if it is a 1 out of 10, and it costs the price of a small island to make, it becomes a strange archaeological site. You start asking how many hundreds of people had to say yes to a bad idea for it to reach the screen.
The smell of desperation and reshoots. Let's start the countdown at number 10 with The Flash from 2023. It is the sinking of the Titanic versus a leaky rowboat. There is a majesty to the scale of the failure. In our previous discussion in episode 1171, we talked about the sincerity threshold. That is the point where the earnestness of the attempt outweighs the technical failure, creating a psychological space where the audience starts to root for the disaster.
That was the weirdest part. They claimed the distorted faces in the Speed Force were an intentional artistic choice. I remember thinking, do they really think we are that gullible? It looked like the characters were melting. It was a visual nightmare that cost over $200 million. When you spend 10 years on a project and the final product looks like a beta version of a PlayStation 2 game, you have failed the sincerity threshold.
That is the quintessential example of trying to fix a movie in post-production. They spent so much time trying to salvage the footage they had that they forgot to give the characters a reason to exist. It had a 15% drop in its second weekend and just never recovered. It is the poster child for a movie that was too expensive to fail, yet too incompetent to succeed. I agree. This one is a notable case because it represents a total lack of technical craft meeting, a very clever marketing gimmick. The second Winnie the Pooh entered the public domain, someone rushed to turn it into a slasher film.
Moving to number 9, we have Expendables 4, or Expend4Blels as they tried to stylize it. This one felt like a direct-to-video movie that somehow escaped into theaters with a $100 million price tag. It currently holds a 14% on Rotten Tomatoes, and honestly, that feels generous.
They took the source material so seriously that it became hilarious. The lighting does not match, the shadows are all wrong, and the action is edited so frantically you cannot tell who is hitting whom. It lacked the charm of the earlier entries and just felt tired. It is the star power vacuum in action. You have all these big names, or names that used to be big, and they are just going through the motions for a paycheck.
It is almost unbelievable for a franchise of this size. When you see Sylvester Stallone and Jason Statham looking bored in their own action movie, the audience is going to be bored too.
There are scenes where the actors are clearly standing in a small room in London while a blurry, low-resolution background of a ship is projected behind them. The lighting on the actors does not match the background, the physics of the explosions are completely off, and it creates this jarring, nauseating experience for the viewer. It is a disaster of post-production fix-it in the mix thinking. They assumed they could just layer in the action later, but they forgot that action requires spatial logic.
It is the sunk cost fallacy in action. They had the stars, they had the brand, and they just assumed they could patch the holes with cheap digital effects. It ends up looking like a high-budget YouTube parody from 2012. It is a perfect example of a director having too much budget and no one to tell him no. Matthew Vaughn is a talented guy, but Argyle felt like he was playing with a $200 million chemistry set and accidentally blew up the lab.
That is the danger of the streaming wars. These tech companies like Apple and Netflix have so much cash that they throw it at big-name directors without any oversight. They want content for the platform, but they forget that movies need a cohesive vision. The result is a movie that feels like a fever dream, where the tone shifts from slapstick comedy to gritty spy action every 5 seconds.
Let's talk about number 7, which is a 2-for-1 special, Rebel Moon Part 1 and Part 2. Zack Snyder's space epic that was originally a Star Wars pitch. It is essentially 5 hours of slow-motion wheat harvesting and exposition dumps.
The sincerity there is off the charts. Snyder truly believes he is making the next mythology with a capital M, but the characters are cardboard. There is a scene where a character talks to a robot for 10 minutes about the nature of joy, and it feels like reading a philosophy textbook written by a teenager who just discovered Nietzsche. It is the development hell cycle where a creator spends so long in their own head that they forget how humans actually talk.
And yet, it has this incredible visual fidelity in some spots, and then looks like a muddy mess in others. It is the ultimate sincerity threshold movie, because it is so earnest and yet so profoundly boring. It is a movie that demands you take it seriously while giving you absolutely no reason to do so.
Number 6 is the one everyone expected, Madam Web. Released in 2024, holding a steady 11% on Rotten Tomatoes, this movie is a miracle of incompetence. The dialogue sounded like it was translated into 3 different languages and then back into English by a broken LLM.
He was in the Amazon with my mom when she was researching spiders right before she died. That line will live in infamy. What fascinates me about Madam Web is that you can see the moments where they clearly change the plot in post-production. The actors' mouths do not match the words they are saying in half the scenes. It is like watching a dubbed foreign film, except it was filmed in English.
That is the development hell cycle in real time. They realized the original plot, which supposedly involved a 1990s period piece and a different villain, did not work. So they tried to rewrite the movie using ADR, which is automated dialogue replacement. It creates this uncanny, disjointed feeling where you feel like you are watching a movie that is actively fighting against its own existence. It is the corporate committee movie. You can see the fingerprints of 40 different executives, all trying to steer the ship in different directions while the ship is already underwater.
This leads us perfectly into the top 5. Number 5 is Borderlands from late 2024. This was a massive intellectual property, a huge fan base, and they cast Kate Blanchett and Kevin Hart. On paper, maybe it works. In reality, it was a disaster. It holds a 10% on Rotten Tomatoes, and lost over 70% of its box office revenue in the second weekend.
It felt like a movie made by people who had seen a picture of the game but had never actually played it. It was loud, it was colorful, and it was completely hollow. It tried so hard to be Guardians of the Galaxy but forgot that those movies have heart. This is the algorithm first approach. The data said people like space heists, they like Kevin Hart, and they like established IP. So they smashed them together regardless of whether it made sense for the world of Borderlands.
I wonder if these movies end up as bait on those illegal streaming sites we discussed in episode 1172. Like, nobody wants to pay for Borderlands, but they might click a watch for free link and end up with a virus.
I would bet on it. These high-profile flops are perfect malware bait because there is still a high level of curiosity but low willingness to pay. People want to see how bad it is, but they do not want to give the studio $20 for the privilege. That curiosity is exactly what the Pirate's Trap exploits.
Number 4 on the list is Joker, Folie à Deux. This one is controversial because the first movie was such a massive hit, but the sequel was a jukebox musical that seemed to actively dislike its own audience. It cost $200 million and made a fraction of that, sitting at a 32%.
It was a fascinating failure. The choice to turn it into a musical where the musical numbers are all imaginary was a bold creative swing that landed flat on its face. It felt like the director was trying to deconstruct the character in a way that left nothing for the fans to hold on to. It is the star power vacuum again, where you have Lady Gaga and Joaquin Phoenix, two of the most talented people on earth, and you give them nothing to do but sing covers of old standards in a prison cell.
It was a very expensive way to tell the fans of the first movie that they were wrong for liking it. That kind of intentional subversion often leads to an unintentional disaster because you alienate your base without gaining a new one. The Rotten Tomatoes score plummeted as soon as people realized what it actually was. It is a movie that thinks it is smarter than the person watching it, which is the quickest way to lose an audience.
Number 3 is Megalopolis. Francis Ford Coppola spent $120 million of his own money on this. It is a movie about a visionary architect in a futuristic New York that looks like ancient Rome. It is completely, utterly insane. It sits at a 46%, but in terms of unintentional disaster, it is a masterpiece.
There is a scene where a live actor in the theater is supposed to talk to the screen. How do you even do that in a suburban multiplex? It was a movie that refused to follow any rules of narrative or logic. It is the sincerity threshold at its peak. He spent decades thinking about this, and the result is something that feels like it was edited by a blender.
I respect Coppola for the swing, but as a movie, it is a catastrophe. It is beautiful in moments, but it is also incomprehensible. It is the ultimate passion project gone wrong. When you have that much legacy and that much money, no one can tell you that the scene with the golden bow and arrow does not make sense. It is a reminder that even the greatest directors need an editor who is not afraid to say no.
Number 2 is the 2025 Snow White remake. This movie was plagued by controversy from the start, but the actual film was a technical nightmare. The CGI dwarves looked terrifying. It is the ultimate example of why more CGI is not a solution for a bad script. It just makes the failure more expensive. Now we're down to the top 2.
It felt like a movie that was trying to please everyone and ended up pleasing no one. They changed the story to be more modern, but in doing so, they lost the simple archetypal power of the original fairy tale. Morbius is the perfect storm. It is a movie that is so generic, so dated, and so fundamentally boring that the internet turned it into a joke. The "It's Morbin Time" meme became more famous than the movie itself. They keep tweaking things until the soul of the movie is completely gone, replaced by a gray digital slurry. It is the corporate committee failure at its most expensive.
And finally, our number 1, the Minecraft movie from 2025. This was the ultimate what were they thinking moment. Taking a game made of blocks and putting Jack Black in a blue shirt in a hyper-realistic world was a choice that will be studied in film schools for years as a warning. It holds a 9% on Rotten Tomatoes.
It looked like a high-budget commercial for a product that does not exist. The visual style was jarring. It was not stylized enough to be artistic, and it was not realistic enough to be immersive. It just looked ugly. And for a brand as big as Minecraft, that is an incredible failure. It holds the record for the most disliked trailer in history for a reason. It was an unintentional disaster that started before the movie even hit theaters.
The kids hated it because it did not look like the game, and the adults hated it because it was a loud, obnoxious mess. It is the perfect storm of a studio not understanding why people like the thing they are adapting. They thought the name Minecraft was enough to carry a $200 million budget. It is the ultimate algorithm-first failure.
You can tell they were rewriting the dialogue after the movie was already shot, trying to fix a plot that made no sense. It is like watching a ventriloquist act where the puppet is a $100 million movie star. But they forget that cinema requires a cohesive vision. The data can tell you what people liked in the past, but it cannot tell you how to make something new that people will love.
The villain's dialogue sounds like it was translated into 5 different languages, and then back into English by an early version of a chatbot. It is a $100 million movie where the main character's big heroic moment is driving a taxi into a guy. There is no costume, no superhero action, just a series of increasingly confusing coincidences. They would rather take the guaranteed money from a tax break than risk a theatrical release that might embarrass them.
The movie tries to set up a massive franchise of Spider-Women, but it never actually shows them in their costumes except for a few seconds of vision footage. It is a disaster of narrative logic, technical execution, and commercial strategy. It is the gold standard for why you should never try to fix it in post when the foundation is made of sand. It is a movie that exists in a state of constant apology for its own existence.
It is the perfect case study. If you want to know how a movie can have all the resources in the world and still fail, watch Madam Web. It is a masterclass in how not to make a film.
You have to look for the sincerity. A movie like Megalopolis is a good, bad movie because it is trying so hard to be profound. It is fascinating to watch Coppola's mind at work, even if it is a mess. A movie like Expendables 4 is just a chore because it is lazy. There is no effort, so there is no joy in the failure. Use the public data. Look at the gap between the critic score and the audience score on Rotten Tomatoes. I think it is because the development hell feedback loop has become more intense. Studios are so afraid of a flop that they overcorrect.
Also, watch the release dates. If a movie has been pushed back 3 or 4 times, that is a massive red flag. It means they have been in the edit suite trying to find a movie that isn't there. The Flash and Snow White are perfect examples of this. Shifting release dates usually mean the studio is panicked.
They are making movies to satisfy an algorithm, but the algorithm doesn't understand narrative cohesion or emotional resonance. It only understands engagement metrics, and as we saw with Morbius, engagement can be a very deceptive signal. 10 years from now, people will still be talking about the Amazon with my mom line from Madam Web. No one will remember the generic superhero movie that came out the month after. It is the sincerity threshold, again. You have to care enough to fail that badly.
People want to share the experience of witnessing a train wreck. It is a communal form of catharsis. If a studio can just prompt an AI to make the CGI look good, or fix the pacing, will we still get these weird, idiosyncratic failures?
The practical takeaway for our listeners is that you can actually spot these doomed productions before the first trailer even drops. Look for the warning signs. Is there a revolving door of directors? Are there reports of massive reshoots 6 months before release? Is the release date being pushed back multiple times? These are the cracks in the skyscraper. The hubris of a director like Coppola or the corporate confusion of a studio like Sony is what creates the magic. You cannot simulate that kind of chaos.
Rather than look at this new thing, you are likely heading for a disaster. And for those of you who want to curate your own disaster watch list, please be careful. In episode 1172, we talked about the pirate's trap.
And you cannot buy taste.
Stick to the legitimate streaming platforms. Most of these disasters end up there pretty quickly anyway, because the studios are desperate to recoup any amount of money. And if you are interested in the darker side of how these movies are distributed online, episode 1172 on the Pirate's Trap is a must. Listen.
It can write a script that follows the rules of 3-act structure and has acceptable dialogue. But AI will never be able to fail as spectacularly as a human being with $100 million and a bad idea.
This has been my Weird Prompts. If you are enjoying the show, A quick review on your podcast app really helps us reach new listeners who might share our love for a good disaster. I think you're right. A disaster like Madam Web is a human achievement. It requires a specific kind of human error, ego, and lack of foresight that a machine just can't replicate.
See you next time.
It is the signature of the human spirit, even if that spirit is currently driving a taxi into a villain in a Sony superhero movie.
This episode was generated using Gemini Flash 3. Text-to-speech engine was Chatterbox.
Thanks for listening to our show, my weird prompts, where our thoughts go from slow takes to facts on cue. We change and follow through. My weird prompts.